Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk to you today. I work in the Nutrition and Behaviour Unit, the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol, and we study loosely, I guess, the relationship between nutrition and behaviour and the effects of our behaviour on nutrition. And I thought, by way of example, I'd just talk about ultra-processing and give you a sense of the kind of research that we conduct. Why ultra-processing is partly because that's all we seem to talk about at the moment, but everybody else is talking about ultra-processing as well. And the potential impact on energy intake. Actually, it's a bit frustrating because everyone seems to talk about ultra-processing, food composition, its impact on our behavior, but we've been looking at this for a very long time. So some of you might recognize this paper by Andrew Prentice, Susan Jebb. They make some important points, I think, in this paper, but what is, I think, relevant here is that we have undergone a change, a radical change in our diet over quite a long period. So, for example, the ratio of carbohydrate and fat in our diet has changed profoundly over quite a long period. But nevertheless, we seem to have forgotten a lot about that research. And now we are really focused on ultra-processed food, the Daily Mail in particular. And what's the evidence that consuming ultra-processed food influences our overweight and levels of obesity? Well, I'd argue it's a bit controversial that the evidence is a bit weak, but some studies have more importance than others, and they are starting to influence government policy. In fact, the UK and other governments are now thinking about legislating against UPFs. This is one study some of you might recognize by Kevin Hall. It was published in 2019. It's been cited well over 2,000 times now, and it has had a very big impact on the way we think about UPFs. Very briefly, it just involved a study, a RCT, participants recruited into a study. They ate ultra-processed foods for 2 weeks ad libitum, that's free access to these foods, or an unprocessed diet. They gained weight on the ultra-processed food. And the key headline finding is that they also increased their energy intake, their daily energy intake, by 500 calories a day. That's a big increase. So this kind of study has had a big impact. What's really surprising, actually, about this study is, and the head scratcher here, is that you can see some of the meals that were presented in this study on the right-hand side. You can see they're multi-component meals. People pick different foods. The head scratcher is that these diets were matched for their energy, carbohydrate, fat, protein, pretty much everything. So the question is, why are they consuming 500 calories more on the ultra-processed diet? We park that thought. I just want to say a little bit about other aspects of the work in our unit. So quite separately, we've been very interested in the effects of blending energy from carbohydrate and fat. And actually, this is a little hotspot of research at the moment. Various groups looking at what happens when we consume foods where there is a near equal amounts of energy derived from fat and carbohydrate. And we know a little bit about the underlying neurobiology here as well. Lots of groups now, including our work from our group at Bristol, showing that when you blend fat and carbohydrate in a food in this way, then foods can become more rewarding. One idea is that you're recruiting separate populations of afferent vagal neurons that are combining to produce super additive effects and promoting greater food reward. So we've been working in that space, trying to figure out how they might impact energy intake, and then we put two and two together. I should say my postdoc, Annika Flynn, had the bold idea to approach Kevin Hall and say, well, hang on, can we have your raw data? Then the lawyers got involved. And I think we're probably the only group to actually have the raw data. And we spent a couple of years digging into these data, trying to figure out what was going on. Turns out that, of course, the diets were matched, but they weren't necessarily matched for what was eaten. You can see here, if you can't see at the back, essentially what this means is that I mentioned different components in the meals. Some people were eating a bit of this, some people a bit of that. And there's wide variation across the meals that were presented. So we asked the question, well, is it possible that people are super smart? They're engaging with these meals and they're picking a bit of carbohydrate and a bit of fat. and maybe across the meal that combines and affects energy intake. Now, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but essentially the answer to the question is yes. At a component level and a meal level, when we compare ultra-processed foods and meals versus unprocessed, you see that actually the ultra-processed diet, even though it's matched, has and is formed from, both at a component and meal level, a better, more optimal blend of energy derived from carbohydrate and fat. So that was really interesting to link these bits of data together. But we also spotted something else in these data that hasn't been reported that I think is really surprising and relevant here. So what you've basically got here are the two diets plotted against energy density. The key headline here has always been that people eat 500 calories more in the ultra-processed diet. Actually, they ate more food in the unprocessed diet, more food by mass. So they're consuming a lower energy dense diet, and that is having a profound effect on the number of calories consumed overall. And it's not because they couldn't have, on the unprocessed diet, consumed a more energy rich diet. They were actually preferentially selecting very low energy dense components in those meals. So in other words, what they're picking, actively picking, are fruits and vegetables. We think that's kind of really interesting. This work, I should say, is under review at the moment, but you can see we can take this carb fat principle and this tendency to pick low energy dense fruits and vegetables and model that. Actually, you can see just those two factors alone are a pretty good predictor of the meals that were consumed in this really very important trial. Just to sort of back this up, we've mentioned triangulation a couple of times already. We can look at the NDNS. So for those of you who don't know NDNS, it's a very large diet nutrition survey across the UK. These are all meals above 400 calories. And we can plot energy intake across NOVA range, which is essentially a range from unprocessed all the way to an exclusively ultra-processed diet on the right-hand side. And the dark blue line there shows, I guess, what one might expect. As you eat a more ultra-processed diet, the meals that you consume tend to be larger. But look at the carbohydrate to fat blend index of those meals, and you can see that nicely parallels that trend. And again, thinking about what happens when you consume an unprocessed diet, again, calories consumed this time plotted against the grams, the weight of these meals. We're looking, by the way, at thousands of meals here, in case you're wondering. If you're exclusively on an unprocessed diet, then you're consuming fewer calories, but a larger amount of food. So I just really want to leave you with a few thoughts about this. I think that what this tells us is that when we talk about junk food, or we talk about ultra-processed food, we talk about foods that are bad for our diets and so on. I think that what's required if we're to implement any change at the public health level is nuance, is understanding of the connection between the foods, the composition of the foods that we eat, and how they influence our behavior, our food choices, and importantly, our energy intake over long periods. The difference in energy intake and behaviors between somebody who is, say, of normal weight and somebody who's overweight is actually quite small. So we need to understand these subtle shifts and changes in our diet and how they impact our behavior over long periods. So in a sense, we're starting perhaps to crack this UPF code. I don't like the term ultra-processed food. I'd much rather, as a scientist, understand the direct causal relationships between things I can measure, composition of foods, and ultimately energy intake and all the ill health that follows. I also think that we need to recognize that there are some benefits of ultra-processed foods. So legislating against a single category throws away some of the positive attributes of ultra-processed foods, which is another reason to try to understand what is going on in better detail. And ultimately, perhaps if we can understand this connection between foods that we choose and consume and how they impact our energy balance over long periods, then perhaps we'll have clear recommendations for healthy weight maintenance. And in particular, I see an opportunity to apply this kind of understanding to interventions in schools and other public health settings. So that's me done. Thank you very much.